Since the early 2000s, Disney has been trying everything in their power to recapture the magic of the Pirates of the Caribbean franchise. With numerous failed attempts at a new franchise, they accidentally created a new subgenre of films in the process. A subgenre I like to call the failed next big thing. But despite Disney's best effort, they never found their next Pirates of the Caribbean, and all these films were buried and forgotten about. 2021's Jungle Cruise is a prime example of this. So today I want to examine this film and try to find out why it never landed with audiences. The original idea for Jungle Cruise can be traced all the way back to 2004, which was 1 year after the release of Pirates of the Caribbean: The Curse of the Black Pearl, as Disney was responding to the runaway success of that film. Pirates of the Caribbean was of course inspired by the Disneyland ride of the same name, so the company looked to other Disneyland rides to adapt to the big screen. Jungle Cruise proved to be the next potential ride-turned-franchise, so work began on that film, with the script being penned by Josh Goldstein and John Norville, who had mostly been known for TV up until this film. 2 years later, it was announced that Al Gough and Miles Miller were going to write the film instead, who were the showrunners behind Smallville, among other big hits. However, this was backtracked once again, as in 2011 it was announced that Shrek's screenwriter, Roger S.H. Schulman, was to write the film with Tom Hanks and Tim Allen starring in the flick. This version, with the Toy Story co-stars, ended up going nowhere, and the original draft written by Josh Goldstein and John Norville was to be used after all, with John Requa and Glenn Ficarra fixing it up with some rewrites. The film finally found a lead with Dwayne "The Rock" Johnson. By now, the year is 2015, a whole 11 years after the film was originally announced. In 2017, Jaume Collet-Serra was brought in as the director, and a year later, Emily Blunt signed on as The Rock's co-star. A final rewrite was done by Oscar nominee Michael Green, which brought the total number of writing credits to 7. However, in 2018, after over a decade in production hell, the film was finally ready to start shooting. Principal photography kicked off on May 16th in Hawaii, on the island of Kauai. Shooting on location proved to be quite a challenge, as the set took 1 month to scout, 2 months to design, and 4 months to build, dress, and landscape. The production designer, Jean-Vincent Pouzos, said in an interview with Disney, "The access was nearly impossible. We relied on drones to scout the location. When construction got up to full speed, the weather changed, and we had rain every day, flooding the sets and slowing down the construction." After 7 weeks of on-location shooting, the rest of the movie was filmed in a studio in Atlanta. For these studio shoots, they built numerous sets, including a 39-foot boat and a water tank to shoot the underwater sequences. Yes, that underwater sequence in the film was actually filmed underwater, with the camera crew using a waterproof camera and the actors holding their breath for 30-second increments. After 95 days of shooting, production wrapped on September 14th, 2018. However, several reshoots were done in mid-2019 for 3 weeks in the studio in Atlanta, because reportedly, the ending needed work. In an interview with Frame.io, the editor of the film, Joel Negron, said this: "There was a third act that was not really working, so we went back and shot in Atlanta again for 3 weeks and pretty much reshaped the entire third act." The film was originally slated to come out on October 11th, 2019, but was moved to July 24th, 2020. Most likely due to these reshoots. But once these reshoots concluded, the film was ready to go into post-production. It spent about a year in post-production before it was shut down in March of 2020 due to the COVID-19 pandemic. However, it resumed in the summer and was completed in the September of 2020. Additionally, these shutdowns resulted in the film's release being pushed back a second time to July 30th, 2021. James Newton Howard wrote the score for the film, and he collaborated with Metallica to record an instrumental version of their song, Nothing Else Matters, which you can hear during the flashback sequence of the Conquistadors. It sounds pretty awesome, and it reminds me of the scores they did for Westworld, where they would take a popular song and through the instrumentation make it fit into the world of the film. Jungle Cruise made its world premiere at Disneyland Resort in California on July 24th, 2021. It had its worldwide release a week later on July 30th, with it simultaneously releasing on Disney+, which is something we'll talk about in a little bit. On its opening weekend, it grossed $35 million. In its theatrical run, it made $116 million in the US and $103 million overseas, for a total gross of $220 million worldwide. And on a reported budget of $200 million, that meant this film was a flop. Which of course invites the question of what went wrong. With all the films I've covered in this series, a movie's failure can be attributed to many different reasons. as there usually is not one aspect that is solely responsible for a movie failing. But with Jungle Cruise, it's different, as we can definitively point our fingers at one thing that caused this movie to fail: the COVID-19 pandemic. However, the issue is a bit more nuanced, so let's explore it a little bit. This film came out in July of 2021, which wasn't the height of the pandemic, but it was still soon enough to feel the effects in everyday life. This was the first summer back from theaters being closed for an entire year, and the film industry was still recovering. Not to mention the Delta variant of the virus was still going around. According to an article by Variety, at the time of Jungle Cruise's release, only 85% of theaters in the US were reopened. Not many people wanted to go out and see a movie unless it was worth it. Additionally, the box office was affected due to the fact that the film was released on Disney Plus with premiere access on the same day. So, a lot of people and families decided to watch this film at home rather than go to the theater. According to Deadline, Jungle Cruise made around $66 million over a 30-day run from this premiere access on Disney Plus, which was priced at $29.99. So technically, the film made $220 million at the box office and $66 million from Disney Plus. It's a fair amount of money, but Jungle Cruise still remained a financial failure due to the fact that movies need to make back at least double their budget in order to break even. But this still makes you wonder if this film would have been a hit if it was released during a normal time. I think before 2019, it could have had the chance to be a success and maybe even a franchise starter. But if it came out nowadays, I think it would probably have the same lukewarm response. Since the pandemic, there has been a shift in the industry, where it seems like less people are going out into the theater for a multitude of reasons. Whether it be because it's too expensive, if the movies aren't good enough, the fact that they'll be streaming in 50 days, or all of these reasons combined. Last year alone, we saw failure after failure from Disney, and even on their projects that would have been surefire hits pre-pandemic. Haunted Mansion was a reboot of a classic Disney movie and it crashed and burned. The Marvels was a part of the once unstoppable MCU and it lost hundreds of millions. Indiana Jones and the Dial of Destiny is a legacy sequel to a classic Hollywood franchise and it failed big time. If any of these movies came out before the pandemic, I bet they would have done pretty well. But post-pandemic, we are seeing more and more blockbusters not make their money back. I think if Jungle Cruise came out today, it wouldn't do that much better at the box office. As I stated earlier, people are only going out to the theater if it's worth it. Think of all the big successes we've had since the pandemic. Top Gun Maverick was an amazing film and it hit with both audiences and critics. Spider-Man No Way Home had endgame level hype building around it and it was the first movie post-pandemic to make over $1 billion. Barbenheimer was a cultural phenomenon which dominated social media and pop culture, with both films breaking all kinds of records. These are all event films, and they did the work in order to get people into seats. Jungle Cruise had the misfortune of both not being attached to a bigger property and also not doing the work in order to become one of these big event films. Also, the movie wasn't good enough to get that great word of mouth to get people into seats, like Top Gun Maverick did. One reason why Top Gun Maverick succeeded is because it was an amazing film and people told their friends and families to go see it. Jungle Cruise is nowhere near that level of quality. It's an enjoyable and fun film, but not amazing. Jungle Cruise currently holds a 63% critic and a 92% audience score on Rotten Tomatoes and a 2.7 out of 5 on Letterboxd. Overall, it got mixed reviews and was forgotten about pretty quickly. But I want to add my own personal thoughts on the movie as well. This movie is fun and entertaining. It has some creative action and some interesting lore surrounding the river and the MacGuffin, which was very reminiscent of classic adventure movies. The main characters are fine and the actors do an alright job, but the highlight for me was the supporting characters, particularly Jesse Plemons' over-the-top villain and Paul Giamatti's small but memorable role. But this movie does have quite a few weak points that I wanted to point out. One thing I like, but also hate about Jungle Cruise is how much this film is inspired by other great adventure movies. You can draw a lot of comparisons to the Indiana Jones and Pirates of the Caribbean franchises in this movie. I like it because it reminds me of these other films I love, but then I'm also reminded of how much better these other films are, and then I hate it. It makes me ask myself, why am I not just watching these other films instead? The thing that upset me most about this movie was the jungle. It was too reliant on CGI and ended up being an ugly mess of nothingness. There are some great sets and great locations that you can tell are real, but they're mostly towards the beginning of the film. and before we get into the actual jungle. This is Jungle Cruise. The jungle should have been its own character and should have been engaging to watch. The film did its best to try and give the jungle character, but it came off very bland and heartless because it didn't feel real and tactile. While watching the movie, I was reminded of two other movies that take place entirely on a river, those being 1972's Deliverance and 1994's The River Wild. These two movies made the environment feel real because they were actually shot in the environment the movie takes place in, and they were not shot on a soundstage. Even Without a Paddle looked more real, and that movie sucked. The Rock is trying his best, but I felt like he was miscast in this role. They're going for a charismatic con man type in the likes of Han Solo or Star-Lord, but The Rock just doesn't have enough swagger to pull this off. He's a perfect action hero, but not a wisecracking scoundrel. A lot of his delivery feels stilted and awkward, most notably when he's delivering his exposition dumps that happen pretty often throughout the film. And that's another gripe I have. A lot of the lore and exposition is spoon-fed to us. It makes it feel like the filmmakers think the audience are idiots, which I don't like. For example, compare how we are introduced to Davy Jones' crew in Pirates of the Caribbean to how we are introduced to the evil undead bad guys in this film, and it's night and day. In Pirates, we learn about Davy Jones' backstory through the dialogue that he and other characters have, and in Jungle Cruise, it's literally just told to us in a flashback with voiceover. It feels cheap and lazy. In 2021, a sequel to this film was announced, but there has not been any updates since 2022, so I have a feeling it will be quietly put to rest. Personally, I think a sequel has potential, as I did like a lot of the world-building aspects of the movie and the vibe it was going for. I just thought the execution was pretty poor. In my opinion, a sequel is very unlikely, since this film didn't make very much money and didn't have a big cultural impact. But who knows, maybe we might see one someday. Or maybe we might get a reboot of the entire film franchise in 20 years, like Disney does with every other property. This was yet another blatant attempt to recapture the magic of the Pirates of the Caribbean franchise. Just because you base a film on a popular Disneyland ride doesn't mean it's going to be a hit at the box office. Just look at Tomorrowland as another example. It was a decent movie that had potential, but any chance of performing well at the box office was ruined by the pandemic. Maybe if it was released at a different time, things would be different, but we'll never know. And it remains as yet another failed next big thing. So what are your thoughts on Jungle Cruise? I'd love to hear them in the comments below. If you liked the video, consider checking out my others in the series and maybe even subscribe. This has been Tom from Eisenhart Productions, and thank you so much for watching. I'll see you next week.